Clara Sutton pressed her fingers against her split lip and told herself she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of all these people who had already seen too much. She had come 2,000 miles for a new life. What she got was a fist before sundown. But the man standing at the edge of that crowd, still quiet gray eyes, cutting through the dust like cold iron. He wasn't looking at her the way the others were. He was looking at Jebediah Rooker, and his hand had already moved to his gun. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach had been 3 days late out of Pueblo. Clara knew, because she had counted every hour of it, counted them, the way a person counts the seconds between lightning and thunder, measuring the distance between herself and something dangerous she couldn't yet name. She had a carpet bag on her lap, a letter folded inside her dress, and a photograph of a man she had never met, pressed between the pages of the only book she'd brought from home. The photograph showed a square-jawed man with a neat mustache and careful eyes. He had written her 12 letters over 4 months. He had described his homestead in Silver Cliff, Colorado, as modest but growing. He had used words like comfortable and promising, and a woman of your quality deserves a proper home. She had read those words so many times she could recite them. She was reciting them to herself when the coach rolled into Silver Cliff on a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of July, the sun hammering the earth like it had a personal grievance against everything beneath it, and Jebediah Rooker was standing in the street waiting for her. He looked nothing like the photograph. The man in the photograph had careful eyes. The man in the street had hungry ones. He was broader through the chest than she'd expected, with a jaw that hadn't met a razor in days, and a way of standing that took up more space than was necessary. Boots planted wide, thumbs hooked in his belt. Looking at her the way a man looks at a piece of livestock he's already paid for and is checking for flaws. "Clara Sutton," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." She stepped down from the coach without waiting for the driver's help, because something in Rooker's posture told her waiting was weakness here. "You're smaller than I pictured." He said it flat like a complaint. "And you're different than your photograph," she said before she could stop herself. Something moved across his face. Not amusement. "Get your bag," he said. The town of Silver Cliff, in the summer of 1883, ran hot and loud and full of men with money to spend, and laws they chose not to follow. The main street was a churn of boots and wagon wheels, saloon noise bleeding out into the afternoon miners, with dust-caked faces moving between the assay office and the nearest whiskey. There was a church at the end of the street, and a jail beside it, and Clara noticed the jail looked considerably more used. Rooker walked 3 paces ahead of her and didn't look back. She carried her own bag. She told herself this was nothing. She told herself he was nervous, maybe first meetings being awkward things. She told herself the way her stomach had tightened when he'd looked at her was just travel exhaustion and July heat. She told herself these things until they were past the edge of town, and none of the other things she'd told herself on the journey west had come true either. And she understood she had a talent for believing what she needed to believe. His wagon was tied to a post outside a feed store. He threw her bag into the bed without ceremony and climbed up front. She climbed up herself again without help, and he turned the horses north before she had fully settled. "What's the land like?" she asked. "Your homestead." "Flat enough," he said. "Your letters mentioned. I know what my letters mentioned." She looked at his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins, not with the easy grip of a man comfortable with horses, but tight, white-knuckled like he was fighting something. "Mr. Rooker," she said carefully, "I want this to work. I came a long way because I believed." "You came," he said, "because you had nowhere else to go. Let's not make it more than it is." Clara said nothing. She watched the mountains in the distance, enormous indifferent snow still capping the peaks even in July, and she made a decision, quiet and internal, that she would reserve her judgment. People were harder in person than on paper. She knew that. She was not naive. She was, however, wrong about almost everything that came next. The homestead was a two-room cabin that smelled of old grease and unwashed laundry. There was a cook stove, a table with one chair pulled up to it, and a cot in the back room that she understood was meant for her. She put her bag down. She looked at the single chair. "I'll need another chair," she said. "You'll eat when I'm done," Rooker said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same flat assessment from the street, and something in her went very still. "That isn't," she began. "You're going to want to learn fast," he said, "how things work here. I'm a patient man, Clara, but patience runs out. You're here to keep this house, cook my meals, and not cause me trouble. That's the arrangement." "That is not what your letters described." "My letters got you here," he said simply. That was the point. The silence in the cabin was absolute. She heard her own heartbeat. She heard the creak of the floor under his boots as he moved to the table and sat down, and she understood with complete clarity that she had made a catastrophic mistake and that there was no one within 100 miles who would help her. "Make supper," Rooker said, and opened a newspaper like the conversation was over. She lasted 4 days. Not because she was weak, because she was calculating. She kept her head down and her eyes open and her ears sharp, and she learned the shape of his anger, the way you learn the shape of weather, the early warning signs, the moments of pressure change before the storm. She cooked his meals. She kept the house. She said yes, sir, and no, sir, and gave him nothing to strike at. But on the 4th evening, she made the mistake of asking about the letter. Not a love letter, nothing so foolish as that. A legal letter she'd found tucked behind the stove when she was cleaning a letter from a man named Cornelius Shaw, attorney at law, Leadville, Colorado, referencing a land deed. The name on the deed wasn't Rooker's. It was her father's. Her father, Thomas Sutton, who had died in March and left her nothing, or so she'd been told. Who had sent her a letter 2 weeks before his death that she hadn't fully understood, rambling and urgent, telling her there was something in the West worth finding, that she needed to be careful, that not everyone was who they claimed to be. "Mr. Rooker," she said, the letter in her hand, "whose land is this?" He looked up from his plate. He looked at the letter. The change in his face was instantaneous and total. "Where did you find that?" His voice had dropped to something very quiet, which she had already learned was more dangerous than loud. "Behind the stove. I was cleaning." "That is none of your concern." "It has my father's name on it." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. She took a step back, and her shoulder hit the wall, and she held on to the letter, because letting go of it felt like letting go of the only thing she had. And he grabbed her wrist, and the pain was sharp and immediate, and she did not cry out, because she would not give him that. "You don't know anything," he said low and close. "You don't ask about that letter. You don't think about that letter. You forget you ever saw it. Do you understand me? You're hurting my wrist. Do you understand me?" "Yes," she said, because her wrist was bending at an angle it wasn't meant to bend, and survival was more important than pride. He let go, stepped back, smoothed the front of his shirt like nothing had happened. "Good girl," he said. She kept the letter. She hid it inside the lining of her carpet bag, sewn in with her mother's thimble and a lock of hair she'd kept from her father's funeral. She hid it, and she did not think about it where her thoughts could show on her face, and she waited. The next morning, he struck her. Not for the letter she'd been careful, for the biscuits which she had made from a recipe her mother had taught her, and which were by any reasonable measure perfectly good biscuits. He said they were dense. She said she was sorry. He backhanded her across the cheek hard enough to knock her sideways into the cook stove, and the hot metal burned her forearm, and she stood up straight and turned around and looked at him and did not say a single word. That silence seemed to surprise him. He left without breakfast. She stood in the cabin alone and pressed her burned arm against the cold water in the wash basin and thought with total clarity, "I will not die in this cabin. I will not die for this man. I will find a way out." She went into town that afternoon on the pretense of needing flour. Rooker's horse was at the saloon, and he wouldn't be out before dark. She walked the main street of Silver Cliff with her cheek bruised and her arm bandaged under her sleeve, and she went to every person who looked like they might help. The dry goods merchant looked at her bruise and looked away. The woman outside the seamstress shop shook her head and went inside. The deputy sheriff, young, soft-faced, with eyes that couldn't quite meet hers, told her that domestic matters between a man and his intended were outside the law's concern. "We're not married yet," Clara said. "Ma'am," the deputy said, "I'd advise you to sort that out with Mr. Rooker directly." She walked out. She stood in the street in the full force of the July sun and understood that Silver Cliff had decided she was Rooker's property, and no one here intended to tell him otherwise. That was when she heard the voice. It came from the far end of the street outside the livery, and it was unhurried and low, and carried the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise itself to be heard. "Boy," the voice said, "you touch that horse again, and I'll take your hand off at the wrist." She turned. There was a young man, barely 17, all elbows and bad judgment, backing away from a buckskin horse tied at the livery post, hands raised, face white. And there was the man who had spoken tall, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the lean build of someone who lived hard and ate only what was necessary, dressed in range clothes that had seen serious use. Dark hair under a battered hat. A face that the sun and wind had carved into something angular and uncompromising. Gray eyes. He was looking at the boy with calm, complete certainty. The look of a man who has said a thing once and has no interest in saying it again. The boy ran. The man watched him go. Then, without any particular hurry, he turned and went back to checking the buckskin's left foreleg, running his hand down the leg, with the focused attention of someone who cares for things that are in his care. Clara was staring. She knew she was staring. She told herself to stop. She did not stop. He looked up. Not at her at first, at the street in general. The practiced scan of a man who keeps track of his surroundings, and then his eyes found her and stopped. She watched him see the bruise. It wasn't a flinch exactly. More like a stillness, very brief, the way a man goes still when he's registered something that troubles him and is deciding what to do about it. He straightened up. He was considerably taller than she'd estimated from a distance. "Ma'am," he said. A nod. "Sir," she said. A pause. The street noise continued around them, wagon wheels, saloon piano men calling to each other across the dust. They were standing in the middle of all of it, and somehow outside of it at the same time. "You all right?" he asked. The question was simple, direct. No pretense of not having seen the bruise. No polite avoidance, no looking away. He asked it the way someone asks when they actually want to know the answer, and Clara had not encountered that quality in Silver Cliff in 5 days, and it hit her harder than she expected. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That's a no," he said. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Gideon Hayes," he said. He didn't offer his hand, just his name, standing easy with his hat brim shading those gray eyes. "Clara Sutton. You're new here. 4 days. Who brought you in?" She hesitated. "Jebediah Rooker." Something happened in Gideon Hayes' face. Not dramatic, it never was. She would learn with this man, but a slight adjustment, a compression around the eyes, like he'd just confirmed something he'd hoped not to confirm. "Mail order?" he asked. The directness of it should have offended her. It didn't. "Yes." "And the bruise?" "I told you I'm Clara." He said her name like he'd known it a long time, like it was a word he was used to being careful with. "I've known Jebediah Rooker for 6 years. I know what he is. You don't have to dress it up for me." She looked at him. This stranger with his gray eyes and his battered hat and his total settled calm. "He hit me this morning," she said. "Over biscuits." Gideon Hayes said nothing for a moment. "Over biscuits," he repeated, quiet as breath. "They were good biscuits," she said, and she didn't know why she added that, except that it was true, and it seemed important somehow that it was true. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, the ghost of one brief and gone. "I don't doubt it," he said. He listened to the rest of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer opinions, or tell her what she should have done differently, or look at her with the particular expression of a man cataloging another person's foolishness. He stood at the edge of the livery with his back to the wall, and his eyes moving the street at intervals alert without being anxious, and he listened the way a man listens when he intends to act on what he hears. She told him about the letters, about the photograph versus the reality, about the 4 days of diminishing hope, and the single chair at the table, and the deputy who had told her domestic matters were outside the law's concern. She did not tell him about the letter with her father's name on it. She wasn't sure why. Instinct, maybe. She had shown enough vulnerability to a stranger already. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've got family somewhere?" he asked. "No. My father died in March. My mother before that. Money. $12 and some cents." He turned and looked at her directly, and she felt the weight of that look, not heavy in an unpleasant way, but substantial, like the look of someone taking a real accounting of a situation. "Here's what I know," he said. "Rooker is not a safe man to be around. The town knows it and won't do anything because Rooker has got Cornelius Shaw's legal backing, and Shaw has got half the town council in his pocket, and the deputy you talked to today answers to a sheriff who answers to Shaw." He paused. "That's the situation." "That's a very discouraging situation," Clara said. "It is." He agreed without apology. "But it's not a finished one." "What does that mean?" He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at the mountains. "I've got a camp up in the high country," he said. 3 hours north. I'm up here to resupply, and I'm heading back tomorrow at first light." He looked at her again. "I'm not in the habit of making offers, I don't mean, and I'm not in the habit of leaving people in situations like yours without saying something about it. So I'm saying if you need to not be here, you can ride with me." Clara stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No." "I could be anything. Anyone." "You could," he said. "I reckon I'll take the chance." "Why?" The question hung between them, genuine and slightly desperate, because she needed to understand it. She had been deceived once already by a man who'd shown her only his best face, and she was not going to be deceived again without at least asking the question. Gideon Hayes looked at the bruise on her face, then at her eyes. "Because somebody should have said something 5 days ago," he said, "and nobody did. And that's a debt this town owes you that I'm not willing to let stand." She said nothing. He picked up the buckskin's lead rope and began walking toward the water trough. "I'll be at the livery at first light," he said without looking back. "It's your choice, Miss Sutton. It always will be." She went back to the cabin. She cooked supper and set the table for one and kept her face blank and her hands steady, while Rooker ate and told her she'd oversalted the beans, which she had done deliberately, though she gave no sign of it. After he went to bed, she sat at the table in the dark, with her carpet bag open in front of her. She took out the letter. Read it again by the thin light of a dying candle. Her father's name. A land deed. Cornelius Shaw. She pressed the letter flat, folded it carefully, put it back in the lining. She looked at the $12 and some cents. She looked at the door. She thought about Gideon Hayes standing at the edge of the livery with his gray eyes and his settled, unshakable calm, saying, "I'm not in the habit of making offers, I don't mean." She thought about the deputy's face carefully avoiding hers. She thought about the seamstress going inside. She thought about Rooker's hand on her wrist. She packed only what was necessary. Everything that mattered fit in her arms. She left the rest. She did not look back at the single chair. She was standing outside the livery in the dark hour before dawn, her carpet bag at her feet, and the stars blazing overhead in that enormous Colorado sky, when she heard boots on the hard-packed ground behind her, and she turned with her heart in her throat, certain for one terrible second that it was Rooker, and it was Gideon Hayes, with the buckskin already saddled, and a second horse on a lead rope, a good-tempered bay mare, who turned her head and regarded Clara with calm, ancient eyes. He stopped when he saw her, looked at her a moment. "Didn't know if you'd come," he said. "I didn't know either," she said honestly. He nodded like that was the right answer. "You'll ride Daisy," he said. "She's steady in mountain terrain. Once we clear the edge of town, we'll push hard. Rooker gets up early." "I know," Clara said. "I made his coffee before I left." Gideon Hayes stopped with his hand on the saddle. "You made his coffee," he said. "I didn't want him to know I was gone until I had a head start." She paused. "And I put the salt in it that I meant to put in the beans last night." The ghost of that near smile again brief and gone. "Mount up, Miss Sutton," he said. She did. They rode north into the dark, the mountains enormous ahead of them, the town of Silver Cliff falling away behind, and Clara did not cry until they were well beyond the last lamplight, and the dark had enough size and privacy to permit it. Even then, she cried quietly without drama, the way a person cries when they have been holding something a very long time and the holding is finally temporarily done. Gideon Hayes rode beside her and said nothing, and did not pretend not to notice, and did not make it smaller than it was. That, more than anything, was when she began to trust him. They rode for nearly 2 hours before Gideon said anything beyond directions. Clara didn't push it. She had learned in 4 days at Rooker's cabin that silence wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes it was the only honest thing a person had left to offer. And Gideon Hayes's silence was not the cold, punishing kind she'd come to know. It was the kind that simply existed the way the mountains existed, without apology and without need of filling. The trail climbed. Not gently. Daisy, true to Gideon's word, was steady and sure-footed in a way that asked nothing of Clara, except that she hold on and trust the horse's judgment, which was easier than trusting her own right now. Her forearm ached where she'd burned it on the stove. Her cheek pulled tight where the bruise had fully darkened overnight. She hadn't looked in a mirror, the cabin hadn't had one, but she could feel the shape of it. She thought about Rooker waking up, finding the coffee she'd made him, drinking it maybe before he realized she was gone. The image gave her a satisfaction she wasn't sure she was entitled to, but she kept it anyway. "You're smiling," Gideon said. She startled. He was looking straight ahead at the trail. "I was thinking about the coffee," she said. "The salted coffee." "Yes." He was quiet a moment. "How much salt?" "Enough," she said. This time the ghost smile made it slightly further before it disappeared. "Good," he said, and went back to watching the trail. They stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses. Clara climbed down stiffly. Her legs had reminded her she hadn't ridden regularly since she was a girl in Ohio, and she stood at the creek bank and splashed cold water on her face, and felt some of the dried fear begin to wash off her. "Rooker will go to the deputy," she said. Not a question. "He will," Gideon said beside her, letting the buckskin drink. "And the deputy will come up the mountain gnome." He said it with quiet certainty. "Deputy Calhoun has ridden into the high country exactly once in the 3 years I've known him. Twisted his ankle on the first hour of trail and turned around. He doesn't have the stomach for the elevation. And Rooker. Rooker's a flat country man. He'll bluster and threaten and send word to Shaw." He paused. "Shaw is a different matter." She looked at him. "You mentioned Shaw yesterday. Cornelius Shaw, the attorney. He's got offices in Leadville, but his real business is land. He's been buying up claims and deeds across this part of Colorado for the better part of 5 years, sometimes legally, mostly through arrangement with men like Rooker, who are willing to do things Shaw prefers not to do himself." His voice was even matter-of-fact. "He's careful, keeps his hands clean on paper." Clara was very still. What kind of arrangements? Pressure, fraud, running people off land they legally own before they know what they've got. He looked at her. "Why?" She held his gaze for a moment. Decided. "I found a letter," she said. "In Rooker's cabin, behind the stove. It was from Shaw, referencing a land deed." She kept her voice steady. "The name on the deed was my father's." Gideon Hayes went absolutely still. Not the easy stillness she'd come to associate with him. A different kind. The stillness of a man who has just watched two separate things click together into a shape he recognizes and does not like. "Your father," he said. "Thomas Sutton." She blinked. "You know his name. I know the deed." His jaw tightened, barely perceptible. "There's a silver claim in the upper valley, northern face of the ridge. It was registered 18 months ago to a Thomas Sutton of Columbus, Ohio." He looked at her. "Your father registered that claim, Clara. It's a good one. Maybe one of the better unworked veins in this district." The creak noise was the only sound for a moment. "He never told me," she said. "He never—" She stopped, thought about the letter. The rambling, urgent letter 2 weeks before he died. Something in the West worth finding. Be careful. Not everyone is who they claim. "He tried to," she said quietly. "I didn't understand what he was telling me." "He died in March," Gideon said, flat, putting it together. "Shaw would have known the claim existed. He'd have been watching for heirs." "And Rooker's letters started before your father died, didn't they?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it now, held in check but present. "I'd wager they started the day Shaw found out Thomas Sutton had a daughter." The full shape of it landed on her all at once. She had not been chosen for a wife. She had been chosen for a signature. Rooker needed her name on a transfer of her father's estate, which included a silver claim worth more money than she could picture, and the most efficient way to get her signature was to get her to Colorado. First, isolated and frightened and dependent on a man who'd already established that her options were zero. She had been purchased. Not for herself. For what she could sign away. "He would have needed me to sign something," she said. "That's why he brought me here." "That's why Shaw arranged it," Gideon said. "Rooker's just the arrangement." She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her. She had expected them to shake. "I have the letter," she said. Gideon looked at her sharply. "I kept it. It's in my bag." Something shifted in his face. "That letter is evidence," he said. "Shaw will want it back. Badly." "Good," Clara said. "Clara, I didn't come 2,000 miles to sign away what my father left me." Her voice was even and absolute. "I didn't survive 4 days of Jebediah Rooker to hand it back to the man who sent him. Whatever that claim is worth, it was my father's. That makes it mine." She looked at Gideon directly. "Now it makes it worth fighting for." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that saw more than they let on. "It does," he said quietly. "It purely does." He offered her his hand up to the saddle. She took it. They rode on. His camp was less a camp, and more a working life transported to elevation, a solid-built cabin against the rock face, tight and weatherproof, with a corral for the horses and a cold box cut into the hillside, and the kind of organized practicality that spoke of a man who had arranged his world exactly as he needed it, and saw no reason to apologize for the simplicity. "You'll take the cabin," he said, unloading the pack horse. "I'll sleep in the lean-to." "That's your bed," she said. "I've slept in worse." He said it without room for argument, not rudely, but with the same settled finality he seemed to apply to most things. She let it stand. She had bigger arguments to save her energy for. Inside the cabin, she sat at his table, a real table with 2 chairs, which struck her as both ordinary and quietly devastating, given where she'd just come from, and she spread the letter flat in front of her and read it again. It was dated February 14th, 6 weeks before her father's death. "Dear Mr. Rooker, pursuant to our arrangement regarding the Sutton claim, the daughter remains our most efficient avenue of transfer. The father's condition continues to deteriorate. Upon his death, the inheritance passes to her in full. Your role is to bring her west before she retains legal counsel. A marriage contract would be cleanest. The deed transfer follows. The original registration is filed in the Fremont County Recorder's Office. Shaw. Clean. Businesslike. Arranging her life like a property transaction." She heard Gideon come in, heard him stop when he saw her face. "Read it," she said, and pushed it across the table. He read it standing, leaning over the table, one hand on the surface. She watched his jaw tighten incrementally as he moved through the lines. When he finished, he straightened up. He turned and walked to the window, stood there with his back to her for a moment. "Shaw put this in writing," he said almost to himself. "He's arrogant," Clara said. "He expected it to end up in a fire. Or he expected Rooker to handle it and not leave paper trails sitting behind his stove." He turned around. "This is a criminal conspiracy, Clara. Fraud. Potentially worse depending on what Shaw intended if you refuse to sign." "I imagine he intended Rooker to be persuasive," she said flatly. Something moved through Gideon's face. Controlled fury held back by will. "There's a federal land office in Pueblo," he said, "and a circuit judge named Harlan Briggs who doesn't answer to Shaw. I've known him 12 years. He's honest." He paused. "That letter combined with your father's original registration is enough to open an investigation." "How do we get to Pueblo?" "Not the direct route. Shaw has men watching the main roads. When something's moving, he wants stopped." He sat down across from her, folded his hands on the table. "We go through the high valley. Takes 2 days. It's harder terrain, but it's mine. I know every foot of it. Nobody follows us up there without me knowing first." She nodded. "In the meantime," he said, "nobody knows you're here except Daisy and the buckskin, and neither of them are talking." She almost smiled. "What's the buckskin's name?" "Moses." "Moses," she repeated. "He parts difficult terrain," Gideon said, perfectly serious. This time she did smile. Brief and small, but real. And she saw him register it, not with any theatrical response, just a slight loosening around the eyes, like something he'd been holding carefully had been set down. She was useful. She made that clear from the first hour. She wasn't a frontier woman by experience, but she was practical by nature, and stubborn enough that the gap between the two felt bridgeable if she applied herself. And she applied herself with a focus that had nowhere else to go now. She helped with the horses. She cooked without being asked, and without waiting to be told she'd done it wrong. She went through her carpet bag and cataloged what she had and what she needed, and told Gideon her inventory without drama. He listened, made one addition to her list without comment, produced a clean length of cloth for her burned arm, and a small tin of salve without making the wound into a conversation. "You've done this before," she said, watching him wrap her forearm with careful, practiced hands. "Tended injuries." "Some," he said. "You live up here alone?" "Mostly." "Since when?" He was quiet a moment. His hands were steady and efficient on the bandage. 5 years, he said. "That's a long time. It suits me." She waited. He tied off the bandage. "My wife died," he said. Not offered as a bid for sympathy, just fact delivered to fill a silence before it became something else. "Fever. The winter of '78. We had a homestead in the valley, after I sold it and came up." He looked at the finished bandage, checking the tension. "The mountain is quieter." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "It was a long time ago." He stood up, met her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man," she said. He had trouble saying the hard thing directly. The letter he sent me." She stopped. "I think he was trying to warn me. He just couldn't bring himself to say outright that someone might try to use me to take what he'd left." She paused. He'd have hated knowing he was right. Gideon looked at her. He registered that claim, paid the fees, filed the paperwork through proper channels. He said it with deliberate weight. He did it right. He was making sure you had something. Don't let anyone take that from him. She held that. Let it settle. "I won't," she said. Yacht. The trouble started before dark. Gideon had gone to check the north perimeter. He had a pattern she'd noticed of moving the boundary of his awareness outward at intervals, checking things she couldn't yet read the signs of when she heard the horses react. Not panicked. Ears up, heads lifted. Alert to something. She went to the door. Looked down the trail. A rider. Single. Moving slow and deliberate the way a man moves when he wants to be seen approaching and not mistaken for a threat. She recognized the horse before she recognized the man. It was a sorrel with a white blaze. She had seen it tied outside the Silver Cliff post office 2 days before her arrival, waiting while its rider went inside. The rider was a young man in his mid-20s, lean and road-worn, with a deputy's star on his shirt that she recognized as Fremont County issue, not the Silver Cliff Town badge. Different jurisdiction entirely. He pulled up 20 feet from the cabin and held both hands loose and visible. "Hello, the house," he called. "Name's Deputy James Whitfield, Fremont County. I'm not here for trouble. I'm looking for Gideon Hayes." "He's not here," Clara said. "Ma'am." He tilted his hat. "With respect, that's his buckskin in the corral." She said nothing. "I know who you are, Miss Sutton," Whitfield said. "And I know what Rooker is. I rode up here because there's something you need to know before you ride into Pueblo." He paused. "Judge Briggs sent me." Gideon's voice came from behind her and slightly to the left, which meant he'd come around the uphill side of the cabin and been watching Whitfield approach for longer than she'd been aware of. "James," he said. "No alarm, just acknowledgement." Whitfield exhaled. "Gideon, I've been riding since before sunup." "Come down," Gideon said. The deputy dismounted and tied his horse, and Gideon stepped up beside Clara in the doorway, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him without contact. And she noticed she had instinctively stepped slightly to the side to let him into a position where he could see the full approach. She noticed she didn't resent it. Whitfield came up and stopped at a respectful distance and took off his hat. He looked at Clara's bruise without looking away the way Gideon had looked at it squarely, without flinching. "Miss Sutton," he said, "Judge Briggs knows about the Sutton claim, has known since your father registered it. He'd been watching Shaw's movements with regard to it." He glanced at Gideon. "Shaw filed a motion in Leadville Court 2 days ago, claiming your father died intestate, and the land should revert to Shaw's exact phrasing was prior settlement interests, which is, that's fraud is what that is, but the Leadville judge owes Shaw favors." "My father had a will," Clara said immediately. Both men looked at her. He wrote me about it. Last year. He said he'd had it witnessed and filed in Columbus." She met Whitfield's eyes. "If Shaw is claiming he died without a will, someone has suppressed it." Whitfield pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Judge Briggs anticipated that. He's already sent to Columbus for records, but the Leadville ruling is scheduled for Friday. That's 3 days. He looked at Gideon. "Shaw has also sent a man named Fletcher up the main trail. Hiram Fletcher. He's—" "I know Fletcher," Gideon said. His voice had gone very quiet. "He's got 2 men with him," Whitfield said. "They'll be here by tomorrow nightfall at the pace they were riding when I passed them." Clara looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the mountains for a moment, then at her. "We leave at dawn," he said. "High Valley route, 2 days to Pueblo." "And Fletcher?" she asked. "Fletcher is my problem," he said. "He's 3 men," Whitfield said. "He's always been 3 men," Gideon said in a tone that closed the subject. He looked at Whitfield. "You're staying tonight. You can ride flank with us tomorrow if you're willing." "That's why Briggs sent me," Whitfield said. Gideon nodded, looked at Clara. "You should eat something. It's going to be a long night." "I'm not tired," she said. "I didn't say tired," he said. "I said long." He held her gaze a moment. "There are things you need to know about the High Valley route before we ride it. Terrain, contingencies. What to do if we get separated." "We won't get separated," she said. Something in his face, not quite a smile, not quite not. "No," he said. "We won't. But you're going to know what to do anyway. That's not negotiable." She looked at him. This man who had offered her a choice and meant it. Who had heard I found a letter and believed her without qualification. Who wrapped her burned arm with careful hands and told her her father had done it right. "All right," she said. "Good," he said, and went to put on coffee. She sat at the table with Whitfield across from her, and Gideon moving behind them, and she spread the Shaw letter flat again and told Whitfield everything from the beginning. The 12 letters, the photograph, the single chair, She told it plainly and without editorializing, and Whitfield listened with his hat in his hands and a jaw that tightened progressively as she spoke. When she finished, he picked up the Shaw letter and read it. He wrote this down. Whitfield said the same note of incredulous recognition that Gideon had hit. Shaw actually wrote this down. He expected it to disappear, Gideon said, setting coffee in front of them. He expected her to disappear, Whitfield said quietly. He looked at Clara. I mean that in the most practical sense. If you'd signed the deed transfer and Rooker had married you. I understand, Clara said. Briggs needs this letter, Whitfield said. He'll have it, Clara said. In Pueblo, in 3 days. She looked at Gideon. Unless something tries to stop us. Gideon sat down across from her. Let something try, he said. Outside the mountain went dark and enormous and absolute, and the stars came out in their full Colorado extravagance, and somewhere below on the main trail, 3 men were riding toward them with Cornelius Shaw's instructions in their pockets. But at this table in this cabin, with this letter on the wood between them and a Fremont County deputy, turning his hat in his hands, and a mountain man looking at her with gray eyes that held no doubt whatsoever, Clara Sutton felt for the first time, since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, that the situation was not decided yet. That the ending of this story was still in her hands. She put her palm flat on the Shaw letter, held it there. Tell me about the High Valley, she said. Tell me everything. And Gideon Hayes looked at her hand on that paper, at the steadiness of it, the intention in it, and he told her. They left before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be. Gideon woke her with a knock on the cabin door, not urgent, but with a quality that said now without needing to say anything else, and Clara was already half-dressed because she had not slept deeply enough to need real waking. She'd lain on his bunk with her boots beside her and her carpet bag pressed against her back, and her mind running the same territory over and over the letter. The deed Fletcher, on the main trail. Friday's ruling in Leadville. The will her father had filed in Columbus that someone had made disappear. She came out in 4 minutes. Gideon looked at her and didn't comment on the speed. That was becoming a language between them, the things he didn't comment on, which carried as much weight as the things he said directly. Whitfield had the horses ready. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been up for an hour already, and he handed Clara a strip of dried beef without ceremony, and she ate it without ceremony, and that was breakfast. Fletcher's pace last night, Gideon said to Whitfield, cinching Moses's saddle. Where does that put him at dawn? Bottom of the north approach, maybe 2 hours behind us if he pushes. He'll push. Gideon looked up the trail. We take the ridge cut off at the Second Creek crossing. It adds 40 minutes, but it loses us the sight line. The ridge cutoff is rough going for... Whitfield glanced at Clara. I'll manage, Clara said before he finished the sentence. Whitfield looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Clara with that steady measuring look. She'll manage, he said simply, and mounted up. The ridge cutoff was rough going. Clara managed. She held Daisy's reins with both hands and leaned into the mare's movement, and did not let herself think about the drop to the left, or the narrowness of the trail, or the way loose shale skittered away from Daisy's hooves and vanished silently into the distance below. She thought about the letter in her bag. She thought about Friday. She thought about her father's handwriting on the registration document she'd never seen, careful and deliberate filing the paperwork right. Doing it right, trying to leave her something worth having. She did not fall. Gideon rode ahead, and Whitfield behind, and when the cutoff rejoined the main High Valley Trail an hour later, Gideon pulled up and looked back at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was something adjacent to it. That was harder than I said it would be, he said. I noticed, Clara said. You did well. I did what I had to. She paused. There's a difference. He looked at her a moment. There is, he said quietly. There purely is. Whitfield made a sound that might have been a cough, and might have been something else. Neither of them looked at him. They were an hour into the High Valley, the trail widening, and the going easier when Clara heard it. She heard it before either of the men reacted, a sound below the normal mountain noise carried on the updraft there and gone. She pulled Daisy up. "Someone's behind us," she said. Gideon had already stopped. He'd heard it too. He sat perfectly still on Moses' head, slightly tilted eyes on the ridgeline behind them. "One horse," he said. "Moving fast. That's not Fletcher's group. Single rider." Whitfield's hand went to his holster. "Moving like he knows the terrain." Gideon looked at a narrow break in the rock to the right. "Take that gap, both of you. I'll wait here." "Gideon," Clara started. "It could be a scout he sent ahead. If it is, I want him to see one rider, not three." He looked at her with absolute calm. "Go." She went. She took Daisy into the gap and pressed close to the rock wall, and Whitfield came in behind her, and she could see through a narrow angle of open space, Gideon on Moses in the middle of the trail, relaxed like a man who had simply stopped to rest his horse. No tension in his posture, nothing to read. The rider came around the bend at a canter and pulled up hard when he saw Gideon. Clara went cold, then hot. It was Rooker, not Fletcher, not a hired man. Jebediah Rooker himself on a roan horse she didn't recognize, with a rifle in a saddle scabbard and 3 days of additional fury compressed into the set of his face. He'd ridden harder than she'd have thought him capable of. He'd found the High Valley route, which meant someone had told him, someone who knew the mountain, who knew Gideon's patterns. "Hayes," Rooker said. "Jebediah." Gideon's voice was exactly the same as it always was. Even, unhurried. "You've got something that belongs to me." "I've got my horse and my rifle and about $4 in my left pocket," Gideon said. "Nothing of yours." "You know what I'm talking about." "I expect I do." A pause. "She doesn't belong to you, Jebediah. She never did." Rooker's hand moved toward the rifle. "That woman has a letter that is legal property connected to a legitimate land transaction, and I want it back. You hand her over, and this ends clean." "It ends clean right now," Gideon said. "You turn around and ride back down, and we don't have a problem that can't be settled in a courtroom." "I'm not going to a courtroom?" "No," Gideon said. "I don't imagine you are." A pause. "Because a courtroom is the one place Shaw can't protect you, and you know it." Rooker's face changed. Clara could see it even from the gap, the calculation running behind his eyes. The anger fighting the fear, fighting the calculation, and the calculation was losing to the anger, which was the most dangerous configuration. "Last chance, Hayes. Send her out." "No." The word was one syllable, flat as iron. Rooker's hand closed on the rifle, and Clara did something she had not fully decided to do until she was already doing it. She walked Daisy out of the gap into the open, into the sight line between the two men. "Mr. Rooker," she said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice steady. Her hands were steady too. Something had changed in her body's relationship with fear, not absence of it, but a different arrangement, fear running underneath rather than through her. "I have the letter," she said. "I know what it says. I know what the claim is worth. I know Shaw's name and Shaw's arrangement and Shaw's handwriting because he was foolish enough to put all of it in writing." She held Rooker's gaze. "I am going to Pueblo. I am going to Judge Briggs, and the only question that remains is whether you ride back down this mountain a man who made some very bad choices for money, or whether you make one more bad choice right now that you cannot take back." Silence. Rooker stared at her. She had spent 4 days learning to read him, and what she read in his face right now was that he had not expected her to be standing here. He had built a picture of her, the frightened woman from Ohio, the one who'd said yes, sir, and kept her eyes down, and the woman in front of him did not match that picture at all. Good, she thought. Let him recalculate. Let him. "You don't know what you're doing," Rooker said. His voice had changed too, quieter, which she knew was not an improvement. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "That's new. I'll grant you that." Rooker looked at Gideon, back at her, at the rifle scabbard. "Don't," Gideon said. One word. So quiet it was barely sound. Rooker's hand came away from the rifle. He held it open and visible, and something went out of his posture, not the anger, but the forward momentum of it, the intent. The calculation had won after all. "Shaw will bury you," he said to Clara, not a threat, almost a warning. "He'll try," she said. Rooker looked at her a long moment. Then he turned his horse. He rode back the way he'd come without another word, and Clara watched him go until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore, and then she let out the breath she'd been holding for about 90 seconds, and her hands shook briefly before she stilled them. Gideon turned Moses and looked at her. He did not say that was reckless, or you should have stayed hidden. He looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Where'd that come from?" "I don't entirely know," she said honestly. "It worked," Whitfield said, riding out of the gap with an expression somewhere between impressed and deeply unsettled. "This time," Gideon said. He was still looking at Clara. "Fletcher is not Rooker. Fletcher doesn't recalculate." He paused. "When we meet Fletcher, you stay back. That is not negotiable." "All right," she said. He held her gaze another moment, checking something, and whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. "We ride," he said. "May." They made the halfway point of the valley by early afternoon, and stopped to rest the horses at a natural shelter in the rock, a place Gideon knew by name, which he called the Notch, which was exactly what it was, a deep cut in the rock face that provided cover on 3 sides, and a clear view of the approach trail from 100 yards out. Whitfield took the horses. Gideon sat with his back to the rock and his eyes on the trail. Clara sat beside him and unpacked the Shaw letter for what she had come to think of as her regular review each reading, finding something new, some additional layer of contempt in Shaw's careful legal phrasing. "The will," she said. "If Shaw suppressed my father's will, that's a federal crime," Gideon said. "Document fraud connected to a land claim crosses into federal jurisdiction. That's why Briggs matters more than the Leadville judge." "Can Briggs stop Friday's ruling?" "He can issue an injunction that overrides it." He looked at her. "If we get to Pueblo by tomorrow evening, he has time. If we don't—" "We will," she said. He almost smiled. "You're very certain about things." "I wasn't always," she said. "I came out here being certain about exactly the wrong things." She folded the letter. "I was certain Rooker's letters were honest. Certain that a mail-order arrangement could become something real if both people tried. Certain that the deputy would help." She paused. "I've revised my approach. Now I'm only certain about things I can touch." He was quiet a moment. "What can you touch?" "That letter. The deed registration my father filed. You." She stopped, aware of how that had landed, but she held it rather than retreating from it. "Your word. The way you said you don't make offers you don't mean." She met his eyes. "Those are the things I'm certain about." Something moved through his face slower this time, less easily controlled than usual. He looked back at the trail. "That's a considerable weight to put on a man," he said. "You carried it before I told you about it," she said. "I'm just naming it." He said nothing. But his posture had shifted slightly, something in the line of his shoulders, a quality of being both more careful and less guarded at the same time. She had learned to read him in small increments, and she read this one and filed it away. Whitfield came back from the horses, looked at the two of them, sat down at a diplomatic distance, and studied the trail with great professional interest. Fletcher came at the Notch from above. That was the first wrong thing, not up the approach trail the way any reasonable man would come, but from the ridge above, which required knowing the terrain well enough to find the goat path that traversed the upper rock face, which meant Fletcher or one of his men had been on this mountain before. The first shot came without warning or conversation. It hit the rock 3 feet to Clara's left, and the sound was enormous in the enclosed space. And Daisy screamed, and Whitfield was shouting something, and Gideon had Clara by the arm, and was moving her behind the deepest part of the rock overhang before she had fully processed what had happened. "Stay down," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it cut through everything. "Stay behind the rock. Don't move until I say." "There's 3 of them. I know where they are." He looked at her for exactly 1 second. "Trust me." She pressed herself against the rock. He was gone. The second shot came from a different angle higher up, and she heard Whitfield return fire from somewhere to her right, and she understood that whatever Gideon had said about knowing the terrain, he had meant it in an operational sense. He had assessed the notch for exactly this contingency, and he knew where to be, and she did not know that yet, and so she stayed where he had put her, and she thought. She thought about the letter in her carpet bag. If Fletcher was here to get it back, the worst outcome wasn't being shot. It was losing the letter. Without it, Friday's ruling went through unopposed, and her father's claim went to Shaw, and everything Rooker had written, and Shaw had planned, and her father had tried to prevent would be complete. She reached into her bag. She took the letter out. And then she did something she had thought of at the table last night, and not mentioned because it had seemed unnecessary. At the time, she took her mother's small sewing kit from the bag's inner lining, and she pressed the letter flat against her body, against her skin beneath her clothing, and she held it there with the flat of her hand until she could work it flat against her ribs, where it would not crinkle with movement. If Fletcher took the bag, he would find it empty. A third shot. Then Gideon's voice from somewhere above her elevated, which meant he had climbed, which meant he was behind them now. "Fletcher?" His voice carried down with the particular quality of stone hard and without echo. "It's over." A pause. Then a voice she hadn't heard before, rough, careful, unhurried. "You've got 1 deputy and a woman, Hayes. I've got 3 rifles." "You had 3 rifles," Gideon said. "Caleb there on the east face doesn't have one anymore." Another pause. Longer. "He's bluffing." A different voice said, younger, nervous. "Am I?" Gideon said. Not a question. Clara heard something she couldn't identify, a scrape of boots on rock, a sharp intake of breath, and then the nervous young voice said very clearly, "He ain't bluffing. Caleb's down." Silence. "Hiram," Gideon said, "I've known you 11 years. You've done things I don't respect, but you've never done something you couldn't walk back from. This is the line. You cross it for Shaw, there is no walking back." A pause. "Is Shaw worth that?" The silence stretched. Clara pressed herself against the rock and held her breath, and felt the letter against her ribs like a second heartbeat. "I got paid," Fletcher said finally. His voice had changed. "I know you did," Gideon said. "Ride back down. Leave the money. Whatever Shaw paid you, it's not worth a federal conspiracy charge, and that's where this lands when it goes to Briggs." He paused. "Walk away, Hiram." Another silence, longer than the last, the kind of silence that has a decision in it. "The woman has a letter," Fletcher said. "Shaw wants it." "Shaw can argue his case in court without it," Gideon said. "That's what courts are for." "He ain't gonna like that." "No," Gideon agreed. "He isn't. But that's his problem, not yours." A pause. "Last time, Hiram. Walk away." Clara heard hoofbeats, 1 horse, then 2, moving back up the ridge. Then Fletcher's voice 1 final time, and she could hear in it the surrender of something he hadn't fully decided to surrender until this moment. "This ain't done, Hayes. Shaw doesn't quit." "Neither do I," Gideon said. The hoofbeats faded. Gideon came back down. He had a cut along his forearm. She saw it when he knelt beside her, and he was breathing slightly harder than usual, which was the most physical evidence of exertion she had seen from him. "Are you hurt?" he asked her. "No." She looked at his arm. "You are." "Rock edge. It's nothing." He straightened up, looked at her with that full, direct look. "You stayed down." "You told me to." "I did." Something in his voice. "Thank you." Whitfield came around the rock with his gun still out, and then holstered it with a hand that trembled slightly, and he looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has just experienced something he will be telling his grandchildren about. "Caleb," Clara said. "Is he—" "Unconscious?" Gideon said. "I'll tie him to his horse and send him back down with a note for the county sheriff in Canyon City. He'll live." He paused. "He's 19 years old. Shaw recruited him out of a saloon 6 months ago. Fletcher, Whitfield asked. Gone. For now. He looked at Clara. He meant it. Shaw doesn't quit. We need to move. Clara stood up. She pressed her hand briefly to her ribs, feeling the letter there. I have the letter, she said. Gideon looked at her, at where her hand was pressed. On your person, he said. I put it there during the shooting. She met his eyes. If Fletcher had taken the bag, he'd have found it empty, Gideon said, slowly, processing this. You thought of that, during the firefight. I had time, she said. You told me to stay down. He looked at her for a long moment, with something in his face that was new. Not the ghost of a smile, not the careful warmth she had started to recognize. Something fuller and less controlled there, and then put away with visible effort. Miss Sutton, he said. Mr. Hayes, she said. Whitfield cleared his throat. We should ride, he said. Just professionally speaking, we should ride now. They rode. The afternoon light was long and amber by the time they cleared the high valley, and the trail began its descent toward lower elevation, and Clara felt the altitude change in her lungs, and in the loosening of the particular tension she had been carrying since dawn, not disappearing, but shifting, redistributing itself into something more manageable. Gideon rode beside her now, instead of ahead, which she noticed without remarking on. Fletcher will report back to Shaw tonight, Whitfield said. He was riding slightly behind them, which Clara was beginning to think was something he did intentionally when the other two were talking. Shaw will know we're heading for Pueblo. He'll file something to delay, Gideon said. Try to get a writ through the Leadville court before we can get to Briggs. Can he? And he'll try. Briggs is expecting us. He glanced at Clara. You should know Briggs is going to want a full statement. Everything. Rooker the letter's your father's letter before he died. The Shaw letter the will. He paused. It will be recorded. It becomes part of the legal record. Good, Clara said. It won't be easy to sit through. I've sat through harder. He was quiet a moment. I know you have. They rode in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that has been earned rather than defaulted into comfortable, in the way that only silence between people who have been through something together can be comfortable. Gideon, she said. Clara, why did you stop ranching after your wife? She said it gently, not probing, just the question plainly asked. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Because everything on the Valley homestead was something we'd built together, he said finally. I couldn't look at any of it without it was like being haunted by everything that should have been. A pause. The mountain doesn't have her in it. It was the only place that was only mine. And now, she said. He looked at her, not sideways, fully directly, the mountain trail requiring no active navigation at this easy grade. Now, he said, and stopped. Started again. Now there's something else in it. He looked back at the trail. I'm still working out what that means. She let that sit between them unelaborated where it belonged. Whitfield behind them very professionally studied a rock formation. They made camp at the tree line as dark came down. Still half a day's ride from Pueblo, and Gideon dressed his arm properly, and Clara made a fire without being asked, and Whitfield produced a folded document from his coat that he handed to Clara across the fire. From Briggs, he said. I was meant to give you this when we were somewhere less eventful. She unfolded it. It was a letter, formal, Fremont County Judicial Header. Miss Sutton. Your father. Thomas Sutton executed a last will and testament in Columbus, Ohio, dated January 3, 1883, witnessed by 2 parties and notarized. A copy has been located and is in transit to this court. The original document names you as sole heir to all property and claims registered in his name. It is this court's intention to ensure that inheritance is honored. Come to Pueblo. Judge H. Briggs. She read it twice. Her father had done it right. All of it. He had registered the claim made. The will sent her the warning letter the only way he could manage imperfectly obliquely, the way a man manages things when he is running out of time and is not sure who to trust. He had done everything he could. He had trusted her to figure out the rest. She folded the letter carefully, held it in both hands for a moment. Gideon was watching her from across the fire. "He left me everything," she said. "He did," Gideon said. "He always had trouble saying the important thing directly. I used to—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I used to tease him about it. His letters always buried the real news in the third paragraph." She pressed her lips together. "The letter he sent me before he died. The warning. It was in the fourth paragraph." Nobody said anything. The fire went on doing what fires do, and the dark pressed close on all sides, and somewhere ahead of them, Pueblo waited with a federal judge and a recorder's office, and the legal machinery that would decide how this ended. Clara pressed the judge's letter against the Shaw letter that was still against her ribs. 2 pieces of paper. One that had tried to take everything. One that gave it back. "Tomorrow," she said. "We get there tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Gideon agreed. And she looked at him across that fire, this man she had known for 3 days and trusted more fully than anyone she had known for years. And she thought, "My father would have liked you." The thought arrived so clearly and so completely that it was almost like hearing his voice. She kept it to herself. She lay down close to the fire, and she slept harder than she had since Ohio, with the mountain holding its cold breath above them, and 2 men she trusted between her and whatever came next. She woke before Gideon did, which she suspected almost never happened. The fire had burned down to coals, and the air had the particular cold clarity of mountain mornings, and she lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the camp. Whitfield's steady breathing, Moses shifting in the makeshift tie line, the absolute indifference of the world around them to everything that was at stake today. She pressed her hand to her ribs, felt the letter still there. Still there. She got up and rebuilt the fire and had coffee on before either man woke, and when Gideon opened his eyes and found her already moving, already functional, he looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being caught off guard, which on his face was subtle enough that most people would miss it entirely. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and handed him coffee. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch. But the space where they almost did had a quality she was aware of, and chose not to examine before she'd had her own cup. Whitfield woke up, assessed the situation with the instincts of a man who had learned to read rooms quickly, and said, "Good morning," to the fire with great concentration. "We need to be in Pueblo by mid-afternoon," Gideon said. He was already thinking forward the way she'd learned he always was. The next hour, the next obstacle, the next thing that needed handling. Briggs's court sits until 5. If Shaw has filed anything overnight, Briggs needs time to respond before the Leadville ruling goes through. "What's the road like from here?" Clara asked. "Open, flat. Faster than yesterday." He looked at her. "The problem with open and flat is that anyone watching the Pueblo approach will see us coming." "Shaw will have someone watching," Whitfield said. "He will." Gideon set down his cup. "We split at the Canyon Road. Whitfield takes the direct route visible, makes noise about it. Clara and I take the dry creek bed south of the main road. It comes up behind the courthouse." Whitfield looked up. "You want me to be bait. I want you to be a deputy doing his job openly," Gideon said, "which you are. Shaw's men watch you. They're not watching us. And if they do more than watch me, then you show them your badge and your Fremont County authorization, and you tell them you're delivering evidence to a federal judge, and any interference is a federal offense." He paused. "They'll back down. Shaw's careful. He doesn't want his men arrested for obstructing a county deputy on official business. Too visible." Whitfield thought about it. "All right," he said. "But I want it noted that this plan involves me riding into Pueblo as a distraction, while you two sneak in through a creek bed." "Noted," Gideon said. "Just so we're clear on the heroics distribution here." Clara almost laughed. It surprised her, the laugh itself, and the fact that it was possible today of all days, with everything balanced on the next several hours. She pressed her lips together, and Whitfield caught it, and something in his young face relaxed a fraction. "Heroics are distributed equally," she said. "You get the visible kind." "That's what I thought," Whitfield said, and drank his coffee. They rode hard. The high country fell away behind them, and the terrain opened, and the horses stretched into a real pace for the first time since Silver Cliff and Clara felt the speed of it in her chest. Not fear, something else, something that had been building for 3 days and was now compressed into forward motion, into the closing distance between her and a courtroom, her and a judge, her and the end of what Shaw had started. An hour out from Pueblo. Gideon pulled up. She pulled Daisy alongside Moses, and Whitfield circled back, and the three of them sat in the road in the full force of the July morning. "This is where we split," Gideon said. He looked at Whitfield. "Give us 40 minutes before you come in on the main road. That's enough time for us to reach Briggs before Shaw's men know we're in the city." 40 minutes, Whitfield confirmed. He looked at Clara. "Miss Sutton." He paused like he was going to say something professional, and then decided against it. "Your father filed that claim right. He did it right. Just I wanted to say that." She looked at him. This young deputy who had ridden through the night because an honest judge had sent him, who had stood fire at the Notch and ridden beside them for 2 days without complaint. "Thank you, James," she said. "First name?" He blinked slightly. "Ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the main road. Gideon watched him go. Then he looked at Clara. "You ready?" She reached inside her dress and drew out the letter. Held it up once in the morning light, this small, ordinary piece of paper, with Shaw's precise handwriting that had set all of this in motion, and put it back. "Let's go," she said. The dry creek bed was exactly as Gideon had described it, passable for horses, if you knew where the firm ground was invisible from the main road emerging behind the Pueblo courthouse, in a narrow alley between the recorder's office and a feed merchant's building that smelled of grain and dust and normalcy. They tied the horses, and Gideon went first to the corner and looked both directions, and then they walked through the front door of the Fremont County Courthouse like two people who had every right to be there, which Clara reminded herself was entirely true. The clerk at the front desk was a small man with ink on his fingers and the expression of someone who had seen considerable trouble walk through his door and had developed a protective neutrality about it. "Judge Briggs," Gideon said. "He's expecting—" The clerk stopped, looked at Clara, at the road dust on both of them, at Gideon's bandaged arm. "He's in chambers, down the hall last door." They went. Briggs was a man in his 60s with white hair and the kind of face that had been making hard decisions for so long it had settled into a permanent quality of careful consideration. He was standing when they came in, which meant he'd heard their boots in the hall, and he looked at Clara with direct, assessing eyes. "Miss Sutton," he said. "Sit down, both of you." "We may not have much time," Gideon said. "I know exactly how much time we have. Sit down." He said it the way a man says it when he means that sitting is itself part of the strategy. They sat. Shaw filed a motion in Leadville at 7 this morning. Judge Carver, who is Shaw's man, has scheduled a hearing for 2 o'clock this afternoon to confirm the intestate ruling. "It's 11:40, Clara said. "Yes, which means we have approximately 2 hours to file a counter-motion, present evidence, and get a federal injunction that overrides Carver's jurisdiction." Briggs looked at her. "Did you bring the letter?" She reached into her dress and put it on his desk. He read it. He read it again. He set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands he is holding something significant. "Shaw wrote this," he said. "In his own hand," Gideon said. "And signed it. He expected it to be destroyed." "He expected a lot of things that didn't happen," Clara said. Briggs looked at her over his reading glasses. Something in his expression adjusted a recalibration, the kind that happens when a person you expected to find frightened turns out to be something else entirely. "The will," he said. The copy from Columbus arrived this morning. It's been authenticated. He opened his desk drawer and produced a document thicker than the Shaw letter official looking, in the way that legal documents from Ohio recorders' offices are official looking. Thomas Sutton, dated January 3rd of this year, sole heir, Clara Margaret Sutton of Columbus, Ohio. He looked at her. That's you. That's me, she said. Her voice was steady, entirely steady. Shaw's intestate claim is fraudulent on its face in light of this document. He either knew the will existed and concealed it, or he failed to conduct the basic legal due diligence that his professional position requires. Briggs paused. Given the letter you've just handed me, I think we both know which it is. Suppression of a testamentary document, Gideon said. At minimum, conspiracy to commit fraud. Possibly more depending on what a full investigation finds. Briggs looked at Clara. I need your full statement. Written, signed, today. I'm ready, she said. It will be unpleasant. Judge Briggs, she said. I have been unpleasant for 5 days. I can manage one more afternoon. He looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes. Then he said very simply, Your father was a thorough man, Miss Sutton. He registered that claim correctly, every document in order. No gaps for Shaw to exploit legally, which is why Shaw had to go around the law instead of through it. He paused. I want you to know that. She had been holding herself very carefully for 2 days. Through the ridge cutoff and Rooker on the trail and Fletcher's rifle and sleeping on hard ground and the long miles of the morning. She had been holding it all very carefully. Something let go briefly, and she pressed her hand flat on Briggs's desk and breathed through it, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and then she straightened up. Let's begin, she said. The statement took 40 minutes. Briggs's clerk recorded it in shorthand and read it back, and Clara corrected 2 minor details and signed it, and Gideon witnessed the signature, and Briggs signed the federal injunction, blocking Carver's 2 o'clock hearing before noon had fully settled over Pueblo. A rider went out with the injunction at 12:15. Clara watched him go from Briggs's window and thought about the distance between here and Leadville and whether 45 minutes was enough margin, and decided there was nothing more she could do about the timing and turned away from the window. Gideon was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on her. Not with the assessing look from earlier days, but with something quieter and more settled, the look of a man who has watched someone do a hard thing and is still watching to make sure they're all right on the other side of it. That's done, she said. The injunction is done, he said. Shaw isn't. I know. He'll come at it differently now. Legal challenges, delay tactics. He's got resources. He's got resources, and I've got that letter in evidence with a federal judge's signature on the intake receipt, she said. I like my position. The corner of his mouth moved. So do I, he said quietly. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away, and the moment stretched a beat longer than it needed to, and then Briggs's clerk knocked on the doorframe and said Whitfield had arrived at the front, and Gideon straightened up, and the moment folded away into the ordinary. Whitfield came in with dried road dust on his jacket and the particular energized quality of a man who had successfully completed something he'd been nervous about. Shaw's man was on the main road, he said. Tall fellow brown horse tried to follow me to the courthouse. What happened? Gideon asked. I arrested him, Whitfield said with a satisfaction he did not attempt to conceal. He had an unregistered firearm, and he identified himself as an employee of Cornelius Shaw, which I noted in the arrest record, which is now sitting in the county jail and available for Judge Briggs's review. He paused. His name is Gerald Pitts. He was apparently supposed to stop us from getting here. He did not succeed, Clara observed. He did not, Whitfield agreed. Briggs had come to the doorway. He looked at Whitfield. I'll want a deposition from Pitts before his lawyer arrives. Shaw will have someone here within the hour. He looked at all 3 of them. You've done well. All of you. He looked at Clara with particular directness. This isn't over. Shaw will fight this in every court he can access, and he has money and connections. But he no longer has the advantage of secrecy, and he no longer has the document he needed. Every move he makes from here forward is visible. He paused. Visible men lose cases, Miss Sutton. That's the only thing you need to know about what comes next. She nodded. When will there be a formal hearing? I'll set it for next week. You'll need to be here. He looked at Gideon. Both of you, if you're willing. We'll be here, Gideon said without hesitation and without looking at Clara for confirmation, and she found she didn't need him to look. The answer he'd given was the same one she'd have given. Bye. They were sitting outside on the courthouse steps in the July afternoon when Shaw arrived. She recognized him before Gideon said his name, not because she'd seen him before, but because she'd been reading his handwriting for 3 days, and a man's handwriting tells you things. Cornelius Shaw was 50-something prosperous, wearing a suit that cost more than most men in this territory earned in a year, with a precise mustache, and the eyes of a man who had spent decades calculating what everything was worth. He came up the courthouse steps with a lawyer in tow, and he saw Clara, and he stopped. Just for a moment. A single second of recalculation. Then he looked at Gideon. Hayes. Shaw. You've caused me considerable inconvenience. I expect so, Gideon said. He did not stand up. He stayed exactly where he was, easy and still, and looked at Shaw with the same level gray attention he turned on everything. Shaw looked at Clara. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in his letter, as a means to an end. A legal instrument, a signature attached to a problem he needed to resolve. Miss Sutton, he said, you've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be. My father left me a silver claim, she said. You tried to take it. I'd say the complication is yours, Mr. Shaw. Your father registered a claim he didn't fully understand the value of. He understood it fine, she said. That's why he made a will. That's why he warned me. That's why you had to go around the law instead of through it, which is what your letter to Rooker makes very clear, and which is now in the possession of a federal judge. She held his gaze. I'd go in and talk to Judge Briggs if I were you. He's expecting you. Shaw looked at her for a long moment. The lawyer beside him shifted his weight. Something moved through Shaw's face. Not defeat, not yet. He was not a man who processed defeat easily or quickly. But awareness. The awareness of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on is not what he thought it was. This isn't finished, he said. No, she agreed. It'll be finished in court. Next week. You're welcome to bring your lawyer. She looked back at the street. Beside her, Gideon said absolutely nothing, which was his way of saying everything. Shaw went inside. The lawyer scurried after him. Whitfield appeared in the doorway behind them. Well, he said. I'll be honest, I was not expecting her to say all that. I was, Gideon said. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the street, the same easy profile she'd learned to read in increments. But there was something in the set of it now, something that hadn't been there on the first morning outside the livery. A quality of companionship so settled it had become structural part of how he was holding himself. Were you? She said. He turned and looked at her. Full direct, the gray eyes open in a way she had come to understand was not his default state with most people, and was with her becoming something closer to natural. From about the second day, he said, when you told me they were good biscuits. She stared at him. That's when you knew, she said. A woman who's just been hit over biscuits and still has the presence of mind to insist they were good ones. He stopped. The ghost smile had become a real one, brief, but unmistakable. Yes, that's when I knew. She felt the warmth of it move through her, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real and steady, and exactly the right size for the moment, the way everything about this man seemed calibrated to what was actually needed rather than what made a good performance. I'm going to need somewhere to stay, she said. While the case is pending, I can't go back to Silvercliff. No, he agreed. And I don't know Pueblo. No. She waited. The cabin, he said. On the mountain. I've been thinking about it. He paused in the way he paused when he was saying a careful thing. It's mine, but it doesn't have to be only mine. He looked at her. If that's acceptable to you. She held his gaze. 2 chairs, she said. Something moved across his face, real and full, and entirely unguarded for one complete second. 2 chairs, he said. Already there. She nodded. Looked back at the street. Let the moment be what it was, not too large, not too small, just exactly what 2 people who had come through something real together were allowed to have. All right, she said. The July sun hammered down on the Pueblo courthouse steps, and somewhere inside, Shaw was sitting across from Judge Briggs and beginning to understand the dimensions of what he'd lost, and the claim was still in the ground, and the letter was in evidence, and her father had done it right, and she was still here. She was still here. Whitfield appeared between them and looked at the street with them. So, he said, what do we do for the next 7 days while we wait for the hearing? Gideon looked at Clara. Clara looked at Gideon. We go back to the mountain, Gideon said. And the way he said, we easy and natural, like a word that had always belonged in that sentence, settled something in Clara's chest that she hadn't known was still unsettled, and she stood up and brushed the dust from her dress and walked down those courthouse steps toward whatever came next. The ride back to the mountain was different from every ride that had come before it. Not easier exactly. The terrain didn't change for sentiment, but something in the quality of the silence between them had shifted the way silence shifts after a thing has been said that cannot be unsaid, after a word, like "we" has been placed in a sentence and left there to mean what it means. Gideon rode beside her, and not ahead the way he'd started doing in the High Valley, and Clara had stopped noticing it as a change, and started noticing it as the way things were. Whitfield had stayed in Pueblo. Briggs needed him for the Pitts deposition and the formal evidence intake, and he'd shaken Clara's hand at the courthouse door with both of his, and told her he'd see her at the hearing, and she'd told him she'd be there, and he'd ridden off with the look of a young man who had done something that mattered, and knew it. Now it was just the 2 of them, and the horses, and the trail climbing back toward elevation. You're quiet, Gideon said. I'm thinking, she said. About the hearing. About after the hearing. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. If Briggs rules in my favor, when Briggs rules in my favor, I'll have a silver claim. In Colorado. That I know nothing about working. You don't work it yourself, Gideon said. You hire a mining operation, license the vein, take a percentage. I don't know how to do any of that. I do, he said, simply, not offering, not pressing, just a fact made available. She looked at him. You know mining law. I've been on this mountain for 5 years. You learn what the mountain has in it. He paused. I know a man in Canyon City, honest operator. He's been looking for a licensed vein on the North Ridge for 2 years. My father's claim is on the North Ridge, she said. I know. She looked at him a moment longer. You've known about the North Ridge claim since before I arrived. I knew a Thomas Sutton had registered it, he said carefully. I didn't know he had a daughter. I didn't know any of the rest. He met her eyes. I want to be clear about that. I am clear about it, she said. I'm not asking it as a suspicion. I'm asking it because I'm trying to understand all the pieces. He nodded. Accepted the distinction. I knew the claim existed. I knew Shaw wanted it. I didn't know why Shaw had brought a woman into it until you told me outside the livery. He paused. When you told me your name, the connection didn't come immediately. It came that night, when I was thinking about what you'd said. And I thought if she's Thomas Sutton's daughter, Shaw didn't bring her here to marry Rooker. He looked at the trail. I thought about riding down to Rooker's cabin that night. Why didn't you... A pause. Because it wasn't my right. Not without knowing what you wanted. He looked at her. You had to choose. I told you that from the start. She had to choose. It always would be. She thought about those words standing at the livery in the dark before dawn with her carpet bag and her $12 and the sound of a town that had decided she didn't matter, and this man saying it's your choice. like it was the most natural thing in the world to hand a frightened woman her own agency back. "It was the right thing to say," she said quietly. "It was the only thing to say," he said. They rode on. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, which Clara found disproportionately comforting, the ordered simplicity of it. The 2 chairs at the table, the cold box in the hillside, and the horses settling back into the corral with the ease of animals returning to familiar ground. She stood in the cabin doorway and looked at those 2 chairs. "I'm going to need some things," she said, "if I'm staying." "Tell me what you need," Gideon said behind her. "A mirror. Not for vanity. I just want to know what my face looks like when I'm talking to people. I've been operating blind for a week." She paused. "Some of my things are still at Rooker's cabin. I'd rather not go back for them." "I'll get them," he said. She turned. "Gideon, Rooker won't touch me," he said. "And I want those things out of his hands. Whatever was your mother's, your father's. It shouldn't be in that cabin." He said it with a quietness that had iron in it. "I'll go tomorrow. You'll stay here." She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and decided not to. Not because she was deferring, she'd made a decision in the last 4 days about the precise difference between deference and trust, and this was trust. He knew Rooker. He knew the terrain. He knew what he was doing. "All right," she said, "but you tell me when you're back." "You'll hear Moses," he said. "Tell me anyway," she said. Something moved in his face. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and it had a warmth to it that the formal words didn't usually carry. He left at first light. She spent the morning doing what she'd been too occupied to do for a week, thinking. Not the reactive moment-to-moment thinking of the last several days, but the longer kind, the kind that requires stillness and security, and the knowledge that the immediate danger has been handled. She thought about the claim, about what it meant to own land in Colorado, about what her father had been trying to build. Not for himself, she understood now, but for her. He had gone west at 60 years old, with a cough that was getting worse, and he had found something worth finding, and he had done the paperwork right, and he had tried to warn her, and he had trusted her to figure out the rest. She had figured out the rest. She sat at the table with paper she'd found in Gideon's supply shelf. He kept a writing kit, which she found she could have predicted, and she wrote a letter to her father's lawyer in Columbus, formal and precise. She described the claim, the will, the hearing, the judge. She asked about her father's other effects. She wrote it in the careful way her father had taught her, and signed it in the careful way her mother had taught her to sign her name, like it meant something like a signature was a promise. She was folding the letter when she heard the first horse. Not Moses. Wrong rhythm. She was at the window before she'd finished the thought. One rider, coming up the east approach, not the main trail, the side trail, the one that came around behind the rock face, the one that required knowing the mountain. She didn't know the horse. She didn't know the rider. She went to Gideon's rifle cabinet. He'd shown her where the key was the first night without explanation, and she'd understood the explanation without needing to hear it. She took out the Winchester and checked the load the way he'd shown her, and went to the door and stood where the frame would give her cover, and waited. The rider came into the yard and pulled up, and she saw his face, and did not lower the rifle because his face was not one she recognized, which was not reassurance. He was 50 or so, well-dressed for the trail. No deputy's star. No gun that she could see, which meant either he wasn't armed or he was careful about not showing it. "Miss Sutton," he said. "You know my name," she said. "I don't know yours." "Robert Hale," he said. "I'm an attorney. Denver office." He reached slowly into his coat and produced a card. "I represent the interests of the Colorado Silver Mining Consortium. I'm here about the Sutton claim." She did not lower the rifle. "Judge Briggs's hearing is next week. If you have business with the claim, that's the place for it." "I'm not here to contest the claim," Hale said carefully, his eyes on the rifle with appropriate respect. "I'm here to make an offer." "Lower," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Your hands. Lower them. Slower." He lowered his hands. She watched every inch of the movement. "Miss Sutton," he said very carefully, "I am not here on behalf of Cornelius Shaw. I want to make that extremely clear." "Then who sent you?" "The consortium has been aware of the North Ridge vein for approximately 18 months. We've been waiting for the claim to clear legal challenge before approaching the registered owner." He paused. "We did not know until 3 days ago that the registered owner had a daughter, and that daughter was now in possession of the claim." Another pause. "We heard what happened with Shaw. We are not Shaw." She held the rifle and thought about Gideon saying, "I know a man in Canyon City." Thought about the shape of things, the vein, the claim, the legal machinery now moving in Briggs's court. "Come back next week," she said. "After the hearing, with your papers." "Miss Sutton." "After the hearing," she said. "With Gideon Hayes present." Hale looked at her steadily for a moment. "Hayes," he said. "You trust Hayes?" "Completely," she said. No hesitation, no qualification. Something in Hale's expression adjusted the same recalibration she'd seen in Briggs, the recognition that the person in front of him was not what the summary had suggested. "After the hearing," he said, "with Hayes." He picked up his reins. "You handle that rifle like you were born to it, Miss Sutton." "I learned last week," she said. He looked at her one more moment, turned his horse and rode back down the east approach. She lowered the rifle. Her hands were completely steady. She looked at them for a moment. These hands that had packed a bag in the dark and sewn a letter against her ribs and pressed flat on a judge's desk. And she thought, I am not the same woman who got off that stagecoach. She wasn't sure exactly when the change had happened. She thought it might not have been a single moment at all. She thought it might have been accumulation, each thing she'd done, each choice she'd made, each time she'd stayed down, when she was told, and stood up when it mattered, until the sum of those things had built something in her that hadn't been there before. She put the rifle back and sat down at the table and finished folding her father's letter. Gideon came back in the early afternoon with her carpetbag over his saddle and a smaller bundle she didn't recognize. She was at the corral before he'd fully dismounted. "Rooker," she said. "Gone," he said. "Cabin was empty. Looks like he left in a hurry." He untied the carpetbag and handed it to her. "Everything I could find that looked like yours." She took it, opened it. Her mother's thimble, the lock of hair from her father's funeral, the photograph she'd brought from Columbus, not the false one of Rooker, but her own. Her father and her mother on their porch in Ohio, squinting into summer light. She pressed the photograph against her palm. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the full measure of what it covered, not just the retrieval, all of it, everything from the livery to this moment. He looked at her. "There was something else," he said. He held out the smaller bundle. "In the back of the cabin, behind where the stove was. I think Rooker left it when he cleared out, didn't want to be caught with it." She unwrapped it. Papers, legal papers. Her hands went still. They were correspondence between Shaw and a man in Columbus, a notary. She read a man named Gerald Fitch, detailing the suppression of Thomas Sutton's will. 3 letters, dates, specific instructions, a payment amount. Gerald Fitch had been paid $400 to misfile the will to mark it as unregistered, to swear, if asked, that Thomas Sutton had died intestate. She read all 3 letters standing at the corral with Moses watching her over the fence post. "Shaw didn't just try to defraud me," she said. Her voice was very even. "He paid someone to falsify the probate record. In Ohio. That's federal," Gideon said. "That crosses state lines. That's not a Colorado matter anymore. That's federal fraud, and Briggs has federal jurisdiction." He was looking at the letters with a focus that had sharpened since she'd started reading. "Clara, those letters and this." "Fitch can be found," she said. "He can be found and charged, and offered a deal to testify against Shaw," Gideon said. "That's how these things go. One man rolls over on the bigger man, and the bigger man—" He stopped. "Goes to prison," she said. "Or settles and loses everything he built on fraud," he said. "Which, given what we now know he built on fraud, is considerable." She held the 3 letters. The Shaw letter against her skin. The Columbus will in Briggs's evidence files. And now this. Her father had done it right, and despite everything Shaw had tried, despite every arrangement and every hired man and every falsified document, the paper trail her father had created honestly had outlasted every piece of deception laid against it. Honesty had more staying power than fraud. It was slower, and it got hit harder, and it didn't have Shaw's resources or Rooker's fists or Fletcher's rifles. But it stayed. "I need to get these to Briggs," she said. "I'll ride with you tomorrow," Gideon said. She looked up at him. He was very close, closer than he'd stood in the ordinary course of things, and she understood it wasn't accidental the way very little about Gideon Hayes was accidental. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight," he said, "you don't have to think about any of it." She looked at him. "What do I think about instead?" He held her gaze for a moment with those gray eyes that had become as familiar to her as the sound of Moses in the corral or the particular quality of mountain silence before dawn. "Whatever you want," he said. "That's the point." She thought about that. Whatever she wanted. The concept had been so foreign 5 days ago that it hadn't even registered as something missing. She had come west for a life she'd been sold a false description of carrying someone else's plan for her existence, and she had arrived to find that plan was a trap, and every person who should have helped her had looked away. And then a man outside a livery had looked directly at her and asked if she was all right and meant it as a genuine question, with room in it for a genuine answer. "I want coffee," she said. "And I want to sit at that table and not think about Shaw, or the hearing, or the consortium attorney who came by this morning." "A consortium attorney came here." His voice sharpened. "Robert Hale, Denver office. I told him to come back after the hearing with his papers, and you present." She paused. "I had your rifle." He stared at her. "He was perfectly polite about it," she said. Gideon looked at her for a full 3 seconds, with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, something between exasperation and a profound involuntary admiration. And then he said, "Come inside," and walked to the cabin, and she followed him in. The hearing was on a Thursday. Briggs's courtroom in Pueblo held maybe 40 people and had 35 in it when Clara walked in, which she hadn't expected, and which told her something about how far the story had traveled in a week. She recognized Whitfield near the front. She did not recognize most of the others, but she recognized the quality of attention in the room, the specific alertness of people who understand that what happens in a room like this decides something real. Shaw was there, across the aisle, with 2 lawyers this time. He looked at her when she came in. She looked back at him steady and direct, and he was the first to look away. Gideon sat beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. Not quite. Briggs came in, and the room stood and sat, and the clerk called the case, and it began. It lasted 4 hours. Shaw's lawyers were good. She gave them that. They challenged the authentication of the Shaw letter, the chain of custody, the credibility of the Columbus will copy. They argued that Rooker's arrangement with Clara had been a legitimate mail-order marriage contract that she had broken by leaving, and that any documents found on the property were therefore subject to question. Briggs let them run. He was patient in the way of a man who knows exactly where the floor is and is content to let others discover it at their own pace. Then Whitfield testified. Then Clara testified. Then Briggs entered the 3 Columbus letters, the Shaw to Fitch correspondence, about the will suppression into the federal record. Shaw's lead lawyer asked for a recess. Briggs denied it. The Fitch letters broke the case open like a seam in rock. Clara watched it happen in real time, the lead lawyer leaning to Shaw and speaking quietly, Shaw's face doing the calculation she'd watched Rooker's face do on the mountain trail, and arriving at the same destination, the math had changed. "Mr. Shaw," Briggs said at the conclusion of testimony, "the federal record now contains documentary evidence of a conspiracy to suppress a registered testamentary document across state lines. Fraudulent misrepresentation in a mail-order arrangement designed to induce Miss Sutton to travel to Colorado under false pretenses and an attempt to fraudulently claim a registered silver claim through fabricated intestate proceedings. He paused. I'm ruling in favor of Miss Clara Sutton as sole legal heir to the Sutton claim on the North Ridge of Fremont County. The intestate ruling issued by Judge Carver in Leadville is hereby vacated, and that ruling is referred to the Federal Oversight Board. Another pause. The federal fraud investigation will proceed separately. I'd suggest, Mr. Shaw, that you speak with your attorneys at length this afternoon. Shaw said nothing. Clara looked at him one last time. This man who had arranged her life like a transaction, who had paid to suppress her father's will, who had sent Rooker's letters, and Fletcher's rifles, and Gerald Pitts on a road to nowhere, and she found she felt less than she expected to. Not nothing, but less than the size of what he'd tried to do. He was smaller than his crimes the way people usually are, and the law was larger than him, and that was the only thing that needed to be true. She looked away first. Not because she was deferring, because he was no longer worth the sustained attention. Gideon's hand found hers under the table, briefly. Just the pressure of it warm and certain, and then he let go before anyone could have said for certain it had happened. She looked at him. He was watching the front of the room with his usual composed attention, the profile she'd learned across a week of mornings and hard miles, and he didn't look at her, but the corner of his mouth had moved. She looked forward, too. Smiled. Outside the courthouse in the July afternoon, Whitfield shook both their hands and told Clara she was the most efficient person he'd ever watched walk through a legal process, and she told him it helped to have the right people around you, and he turned red and professional simultaneously and excused himself to file his final deposition. Robert Hale was waiting at the bottom of the steps. "Miss Sutton," he said. He looked at Gideon. "Hayes." "Hale," Gideon said. Not unfriendly, measured. "The consortium's offer still stands," Hale said. "Now that the claim is clear, we'd like to discuss licensing terms." "Schedule a meeting," Clara said. "In writing, through Judge Briggs's office, so there's a record." She paused. "Bring your full terms. Mr. Hayes will be present." "Understood." Hale looked at Gideon. "She does that every time, doesn't she?" "Every time," Gideon said. Hale allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "I'll be in touch." He walked away. Clara looked at Gideon. "Did you know Hale before this?" she asked. "I've dealt with the consortium before. Hale is honest, for a Denver attorney." He paused. "The offer will be reasonable. The North Ridge vein is good, but not extraordinary. It'll produce steady income, not a fortune. Enough to build something real." "Something real," she said. "Yes." She looked at the courthouse, at the street, at the mountains in the distance, enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to courts and claims and the calculations of men like Shaw. "I want to work the claim myself," she said. "Not just license it. I want to understand what my father found, what he left me." She looked at Gideon. "Is that possible?" He thought about it seriously, which was what she'd expected from him. "You'd need to learn the operation. It takes time." "I have time," she said. "You'd need to be on the mountain," he said. "Regularly, for the first season at least." "I know," she said. "I'm planning on it." He looked at her. The gray eyes open and direct, and for once not guardedly composed at all. Something in them she recognized because she'd seen it once before briefly, when she'd told him the biscuits were good, a kind of helpless recognition, a man confronting something he hadn't planned for, and finding he had no argument against it. "Clara," he said. "Gideon," she said. "I need to say something." "All right." He looked at the mountains, back at her. The careful man choosing careful words, and she waited because she had learned that his silences were always worth waiting through. "I came up to the mountain 5 years ago because I needed somewhere that was only mine," he said. "No history in it, no grief in it, just the work and the terrain and the quiet." He paused. "I'm telling you this so you know what I'm saying when I say that the last week you on that mountain, it doesn't feel like an intrusion. It doesn't feel like something I'm tolerating." He stopped, looked at her directly. It feels like the mountain finally got something right. The street went on around them. Horses' voices, the ordinary noise of a Thursday afternoon in Pueblo, Colorado, 1883. Clara looked at this man, solitary and careful and utterly without deception, who had offered her a choice in the dark outside a livery and meant every word of it, who had wrapped her burned arm and told her her father had done it right, and sat beside her in a courtroom while the law did what law is supposed to do, when honest people refused to let it be bent, and she thought about what her father had written in that last letter. Not everyone is who they claim. Gideon Hayes was exactly who he claimed, every inch of him. The mountain didn't get it right on its own, she said. You chose to stop. He looked at her. Outside the livery, she said. You could have kept walking. You'd seen a bruised woman before, I imagine. You could have told yourself it wasn't your business. She held his gaze. You stopped. That was a choice. That was you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, best choice I've made in 5 years. She stepped forward and took his hand. Not tentatively, not with apology or hesitation. She took it the way she'd taken Daisy's reins on the ridge cutoff, with both hands and full commitment, because the only way through hard terrain was to decide and ride. He closed his hand around hers and held on. Let's go home, she said. And Gideon Hayes looked at her. This woman who had arrived on his mountain with a bruised face and $12 and a letter sewn against her ribs, who had stood in front of Rooker on a mountain trail and in front of Shaw in a federal courtroom with the same unshakable, clear-eyed certainty. And he said, "Yes, ma'am," in the voice that made the formal words mean everything else. They rode north. The mountain waited above them, patient and permanent, and large enough to hold whatever they brought to it. The claim was hers. The cabin had 2 chairs, the hearing was done, and the law had done its work, and the man who had tried to buy her future had been handed his own instead. Her father had done it right, and she had done the rest. That was enough. That was everything. That was how it was going to stay.